Okay, cool, we're good.
Good. Reaffirming our sole contention is revitalizing the BRI. The initiative's sustainability is faltering, with China losing their ability to fund the BRI because they lost their current account surplus and investment fell 40% just last year. Evans Pritchard of the Sydney Morning Herald in 2019 finds that the BRI made financial sense when China had a fat current account surplus, but China's surplus has now vanished. Investment peaked in 2017 and fell 40% in 2018. Indeed, Huafeng of CNBC explains in 2019 that China is facing a serious financing challenge, with most of the countries along the road not having the money to pay for the projects. Huafeng quantifies that there is a $500 billion funding gap every single year. Without the EU support, the BRI is destined to fail. Curtin of the European Institute of Romania explains in 2017 that China can't fund the BRI alone, and without European cash, it is highly improbable that other actors could feasibly join China in funding the initiative. The EU joining the BRI kickstarts investment in two ways. First is spurring EU funding. Curtin continues that the EU is the only body large enough, with the most influence, and willing to invest into the BRI. Thus, Curtin concludes that the only possible and truly necessary partner is the European Union. The path to Europe can only open up with Europe's support and financial participation. Second is legitimizing the BRI's efforts. Currently, O'Day of the IPE magazine explains that the vast majority of private investors into the BRI have been Chinese because foreign investors fear geopolitical repercussions. However, when the EU is a co-owner of the BRI, global investors will start investing because the EU would legitimize the project. Smith of the Heritage Foundation in 2019 writes that endorsing the BRI gives it legitimacy. For example, after Italy joined the BRI, there was a new source of legitimacy added to the program, and other countries quickly followed suit. Saving the BRI is critical for two reasons. Subpoint A is bringing opportunity. The BRI brings new opportunities to those in need in two ways. First is building infrastructure. With proper investment and funding, Meyer of the University of Pennsylvania writes in 2019, that China will spend $1 trillion on transportation and energy infrastructure to connect Europe and Asia through ports, railways, and oil pipelines. These infrastructure plans create strong economic development, bringing new social benefits. Fuentes of Brookings explains in 2015 that infrastructure allows for higher levels of employment, education, and healthcare by connecting households to metropolitan areas. Second is by boosting trade. With new investments, Ruda of the World Bank explains in 2018 that the BRI would decrease travel times along economic corridors by 12% and the rest of the world by 3%, increasing trade and investment. Indeed, Herrero of Econ Store explains in 2016 that overall EU trade would rise by 6% and that of all areas affected by the BRI, the EU has the most to gain from the program. The impact is poverty. New economic prospects and opportunities would bring millions out of poverty, as Ruda concludes that the BRI could successfully pull 7.6 million out of extreme poverty and 32 million from moderate poverty. Subpoint B is green technology. Currently, Bala Fortune explains in 2019 that China has become the global leader in production of clean energy equipment and of clean energy itself. Additionally, Cup of Greenbase explains in 2018 that developing countries are hoping to change to renewable technologies. However, with the BRI being installed, this positive trend is being dragged down as well. Lashir of the EESI explains in 2018 that China is using the BRI as a vehicle to facilitate the norms of green technology and to set up markets for their growing green technology sector. Critically, Jaff of the CFR explains in 2018 that China would bring clean energy to the BRI, challenging the American foothold in the green tech market. Empirically, China has followed through on their promise to bring clean infrastructure. Arya of Brookings explains in 2018 that China has already invested $25 billion into clean infrastructure for developing countries as a part of the BRI. Bringing new green technology to developing countries is crucial to curb global carbon emissions. The Center for Global Development in finds that 63% of current carbon emissions are from developing countries. Saving the environment has two impacts, and the first is food spikes. Adam of the Scientific American finds in 2019 that every 1 degree increase in temperature, crop yields decrease by 7%. Unfortunately, a ray of Greenbiz terminalizes in 2019 that as climate change ramps up every single year, consumable food calories become more difficult to attain, affecting 50 million who depend on it every single year. The second impact is mortality. The WHO finds in 2014 that climate change would cause 250,000 additional deaths per year, and thus we affirm.
Can we see the first card on the legitimization, geopolitical repercussions of investing?
Okay, yeah.
Here's how I can do it.
Yeah.
Is everybody good? Andrew and I negate. Our sole contention is taking our horse to the Belton Road. BRI lending has shrunk dramatically in recent years, as Meyer, a Wharton professor, finds in 2019 that BRI lending by major Chinese banks has dropped 89% since 2005, and lending by commercial banks has ceased almost entirely due to financial issues domestically. Essentially, BRI is on full crisis mode, as Langston concludes in 2019 that the BRI is doomed to failure if it cannot leverage third-party financing, which is why the EU is the ideal funder. There are two areas where this provides immense benefits. Thus, subpoint A is preventing debt disasters. First is adding to Europe's additional debt. BRI investments are incredibly expensive and lead to high levels of debt. For example, Ted of the Financial Times in 2019 says that throughout BRI, China has thrown billions of dollars into investment projects that reap little economic benefit, which is why they have netted over $28 trillion in debt with a debt-to-GDP ratio of over 280%. Thankfully, major European countries aren't ready to invest yet, as the EU has not joined as a bloc. Now, this would be the worst time for high debt levels in Europe, as Elliot of The Guardian in 2018 explains that the Eurozone growth has slumped to the lowest in years and is currently at high risk of a recession. The impact of a high national debt is being unprepared to combat incoming recessions. Gilda Ducci in 2018 explains that high debt constrains countries' abilities to pass stimulus packages and pro-growth policies to mitigate the effects of a recession, which is why Sean Tooley in 2018 finds that countries with high debt don't respond aggressively to economic downturns. Indeed, Romer in 2017 confirms that recessions with a high debt-to-GDP ratio last on average 66% longer. This hits developing nations the hardest, as a recent report by the IMF finds that the next crisis could push upwards of 900 million people into poverty. Time is of the essence during a recession as well, as a 2009 report from Oxfam finds that every minute 100 people are pushed into poverty during a recession. Second is through the BRI. The National Review in 2018 finds that the heart of the BRI is the debt trap diplomacy, where China gives loans for projects with high interest rates and short repayment periods. Already, DEN 2019 finds that BRI countries have high debt owed to China, which is increasing their risk of default. Hurley in 2019 contextualizes this by finding that 23 countries are in debt distress in the BRI due to these debt traps. Currently, the EU is leveraging China, as Jasmine Bouchard in 2018 finds that the EU is pressuring China to adopt EU standards for its project that would stop debt traps in BRI countries, in which China is willing to listen. Indeed, Dasgupta in 2019 explains that China is currently reforming these areas due to growing criticism. However, Smith in 2019 finds that if there are more EU members than join, then China has less of a reason to listen to these reforms because they are a member. When these countries have high debt levels, they are forced to make massive austerity cuts, which raises taxes while simultaneously drastically making cuts to crucial poverty alleviation programs, such as programs in education. Unfortunately, Gomez in 2018 finds that these programs contribute to poverty in countries. Subpoint B is green tech. Green tech is increasingly becoming affordable, as Matt Egan of CNN in 2019 reports that the price of renewable energy has decreased by 90% within recent years and is continuing to decrease, which is why Cuff in 2019 reports that developing countries are switching their focus to rolling out renewable energy. Unfortunately, Hilton in 2019 finds that domestic regulations within China have forced fossil fuel companies to spread their services throughout the BRI in hopes of survival. Indeed, Nakoto in 2019 finds that 90% of our BRI energy projects have fossil fuels involved, which is increasing emissions. When China brings these new energy services to developing countries, Zedek of Brookings in 2019 finds that these countries are locked into using dirty infrastructure for decades, as it involves long-term planning and governmental changes, which is why he ultimately concludes that BRI countries could account for 50% of global emissions by 2050, up from 15% now. A ton of the Scientific American finds in a meta-analysis that for every 1% increase in temperature, crop yields decrease by 7%. This has tangible impact on cultures that rely on subsistence agriculture. As Ray in 2019 terminalizes the climate change ramps up every year, consumable food calories will go down, which will cut 15 million people for food. We kind of the same.
We're on track. Sorry.
Okay.
Good.
Actually, we're going to take a second. That was 3.
11 total. Sure.
argument about Europe, like in the debt argument, just that Europe gets debt trapped?
Yeah.
Wait, so you're saying that like Europe is going to get debt trapped by China, like the entire EU?
So let's explain. What we're saying that right now is if EU joins, they are going to go into a massive amount of debt. That is going to trigger the impending European recession. Why? Because Europe is going to finance the project. That's what both teams agree to in our case.
Wait, so Europe finances the project there in debt?
Exactly. We read the Eurozone evidence that says that right now, because Europe is currently having their economy is going down overall, we see that this could be the pushover that's going to lead to a recession. I get a question.
Yeah.
Okay. So in your first like warrant about investment, you say that China is going to spend $1 trillion on new infrastructure projects.
Yeah.
Considering that China is currently witnessing like massive depletion of foreign reserves, how are they going to fund this $1 trillion of like infrastructure investment?
A, EU public investment, but B, they also trigger other private investment that isn't investing right now because the EU, because people don't see it as legitimate.
In terms of the first link, why does that make any sense? Because your evidence explicitly reads that China is going to bring this funding. So wouldn't that mean that the EU funding is actually the right line to this new investment?
What?
So okay, you said I asked the question, right?
Yeah.
China spends $1 trillion.
Sure.
You say that they're going to get money from Europe.
Yeah.
Doesn't that like just mean that Europe is going to be funding it? Why does that mean that China's funding it?
It's just in general, the BRI is going to have a $1 trillion infrastructure.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
Can I ask you another question?
Sure.
So, is the only reason why Europe would go into a recession because they're like spending?
Our argument, yeah, I'd probably say like our
Wait,
sole link
so,
is spending.
so that's the only reason the EU would go into recession because they're going to
Okay,
join the BRI.
so right now,
and
like
spend.
we read the Eurozone evidence about how right now the European Union is not seeing a good economic growth. The reason this is significant is because the BRI is going to be a massive infrastructure project that both teams agree Europe is going to have to fund.
Doesn't that mean-
This is going to push them into more debt because they don't have the capital to spend
If
right
the
now.
Eurozone's already going in the wrong direction, doesn't that mean recession's inevitable?
BRI puts it over the edge. And yes, our argument is precisely that recessions are inevitable. The reason you should vote negative is to actually reduce the time that recessions take.
Okay.
Because our evidence says that high debt to GDP ratio means that recessions last 66 times longer.
Yeah.
We get rid of the high debt to GDP. Can I get a question?
Yep.
So on green technology, y'all talk about how voting affirmative is going to be good.
Yep.
How can voting affirmative possibly be good for green technology and like coal emissions and emissions in general if 90% of BRI financed projects are in the coal industry?
Here's why. In the past, all like the coal projects that you're talking about,
Yeah.
green technology hadn't been innovated enough to where it's more profitable than coal.
So-
And, like that's why we both. You read the evidence that says now renewable technology is way more profitable, which is why China's going to start exporting it. However, the only reason why they're not exporting it is because of the BRI.
So that's not why. It's not about profitability. China currently passed a lot of regulation internally that is pushing coal industries abroad. The reason this is important is because it's not because of the economy, but rather Xi Jinping's domestic changing on the coal stance.
I would say
what
that-
this means is that these countries go abroad, and that is uniquely why BRI is going to see a lot more coal emissions because these coal companies have nowhere to go.
Alright, awesome. So I would pause right now before you start talking to the person next to you. Take out that separate sheet of paper. I want you to write an RFP. If the round were to end right now, how would you vote and why? And I would say if you were the debaters in the front of the room, I would also do this activity.
Sorry.
Cool, thanks.
He's like changed his stance.
Maybe probably like 2 minutes, right? So, since we're like not that far. you guys need more time on that?
Wait, do we have to pull Grand Cross when we talk about it?
You're gonna, every cross, you're gonna write another article.
I don't know, but do we have to flow the cross?
I would probably, if there's a question that you feel like is like relevant and you wanna talk about how it played into strategy, you'll go that. But you don't have to like
Okay.
write down every single thing.
Okay.
Whenever you four are ready.
Okay. Let's start.
Everyone ready?
Yeah.
Start on their subpoint A about the debt. On their first link about Europe. Few responses here. First of all, realize that debt traps can't even happen in Europe because of the stringent regulations that the European economy puts. That's Broish in 2018, which says that the robust market approach that Europe uses into ensures that things like debt traps never happen. Because essentially, even though China might be doing infrastructure in Europe, they would essentially use their domestic regulations and EU regulations as a whole to ensure that debt traps never happen. But second of all, realize that their link doesn't make any sense at all whatsoever. They are saying that the EU is going to go fund the BRI, and then the BRI is then going to go fund the EU projects, which are going to result in a recession in the EU. Then why doesn't just the EU not fund the BRI in the first place? EU investors are smart. They're state-owned, they're state-run investors. They're not going to be doing that. But even if you buy that, you can turn it against them because realize that infrastructure projects are the only way to actually solve for the recession. They essentially don't give any solvency, whereas infrastructure projects are historically the only way that has resulted in recession recovery because of all the employment and jobs that it creates. It's basically just acting as a market-based, stimulus-based approach to the economy. Now on their second link about the BRI. First of all, you can turn it against them because of the fact that if you increase the amount of funding to the BRI, that can result in China waiving off more of the debt. For example, according to the boss for the Newslands in 2019, China has already waived off much of Pakistan's debt already because they view it as geopolitically strategic for them to waive off the debt as opposed to Pakistan just having more and more debt accumulated because then it puts them at an economically disadvantageous situation. So essentially what we're going to see here is that if the EU gives more money to China, then China can do more things like waiving off the debt like they did in Pakistan. But second of all, in direct response to the Dasgupta and Smith evidence, Buresh notes that the reason why China is listening to the EU and other countries on the BRI and fixing the debt is because it's in their own interest to do so. Because reforming the debt trap is advantageous for them for a few reasons. First of all, they want to have international clout, and the only way they do that is if they have sustainable infrastructure development where they ensure that countries aren't doing that. That's the only way that they can ensure that the BRI continues in the future. Countries are never going to join the BRI if they think that China is going to put them in debt trap. But now on their second contention about subpoint B about the green tech. Few responses here. First of all, on their Hilton evidence, essentially what they talk about is how coal companies, because of their survival, want to go to the BRI. Keyword survival. What this means is that coal companies right now are struggling in China, and that is exactly why in the long term they are only going to move to green tech. That is exactly why Chinese coal companies right now are the biggest investors globally into green technology. They are trying to do the switch as fast as possible, and the only way that happens is if you affirm the resolution and give them the more money to be able to do so. But second of all, on their Zedek evidence, they talk about how the lock-in effect is going to happen, but realize that insofar as China is putting $25 million into ensuring that that there is actually some green technology, they're not doing solely fossil fuels. At that point, there isn't a lock-in effect. Don't let them try to short-circuit our argument later on in the round. But then third of all, we have to evaluate what China's long-term motivations are actually going to be when it comes to green tech. We would argue that they have three long-term motivations that outweigh theirs. First, an economic incentive. Like they said in the very first part of their subpoint B, it is cheaper and is getting cheaper every single year to do that. That means that China is going to give them the green tech in the future because it's cheaper than coal. But second of all, they have a geopolitical advantage. Like they said with their own cuff card, developing countries want the green tech, which just goes to show how China will give them the green tech because it's the best geopolitical strategy. It's the only way to ensure that BRI continues. But third of all, they want an international cloud, like I said before. They want to be seen as the counterbalance to the United States internationally when it comes to environment policy. But finally, we outweigh for a few reasons. First of all, infrastructure ensures that people can be lifted out of poverty, and that is the only way to adapt to climate change. And second of all, if you increase trade, that decreases the amount of trade costs, which reduces the negative effects of decreased crop yields. The only way that people can effectively actually get food and prevent entire societies from going to starvation is if you decrease the cost of food, and the only way that happens is by increasing trade links through the BRI.
Can we see the like the Baresh evidence that says it's in their own interest to stop death traps?
Oh yeah, sure.
Also, do you guys read like evidence that says China coal companies are the biggest investors in like new
No.
technology?
That's just rhetoric.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I got it.
Okay, that's fine. 30 total.
Ollie, your battery's running low. Oh.
Don't worry, I'm gonna fix it.
You can just move this
Here's the extension cords.
Oh, the fire hazard back there?
What? Are you?
Oh my.
What is that?
What the?
Hey, no cussing.
I said what the?
Don't break anything.
We're still recording. We can cut this part out.
recording.
Yeah.
Well,
Shoot.
shoot. How I got underscore on Twitter.
Oh well. Did we get one? Just need one. No, just need one. Thank you. It's not plugged in. Oh crap. Yeah, just unplug that. Here, plug that in back there. We're good. We're chilling. It's okay. Alright, yep, we're good.
Alright.
Alright, you guys are doing a great job. Keep going. Just checking something.
It's going to be starting with our own case, and then going to their case. Frontlining first. Is everyone ready? Start with our first word on Europe. They completely misunderstand it. Our argument isn't that Europe goes into debt traps. Our argument is that Europe is going to finance the BRI, which we both agreed to, and that's a lot of money. Building railroads between Europe and China and building a lot of ports is a lot of money for these countries, which is why China is already in a lot of debt, and if Europe takes that burden of funding, they're going to be in a lot of debt. At that point, their first two responses don't apply. They're about debt traps in Europe, not about Europe financing the project, which is a lot of money. Their third response says that infrastructure is key for solving recessions. Our national review evidence from the second warrant tells you not this kind of infrastructure because it's focused on China expanding our geopolitical interests and not economic gains. This is why every time they build a port, they don't really trade too much in it, but rather just bring their military to it, which means it's not about actually solving the economy. That's really important because we tell you a recession happens in both worlds, but our recession's a lot better because when the EU has high debt, Romer tells you the recession lasts 66% longer, and Oxfam tells you that every minute there is a recession, 100 more people go into poverty. Here's why this outweighs both of their arguments. First, on scope. First, because we tell you specifically our first impact on trade. If EU's entering a recession and it's going to be lasting a lot longer, there isn't going to be trade, which means none of our impacts happening. But secondly, on their climate change impact, remember they even tell you that we need to prepare for impacts. If people are in poverty, they aren't going to be ready for the impacts of poverty, or if people are in poverty, they're not going to be ready for the impacts of climate change, which means they can't react to it. On our second warrant, when we talk about like BRI countries, they just tell you their whole response is that it's beneficial for the geopolitically to actually allow for them to stop doing debt traps. Not true. What we tell you is that when they have control over regions through debt traps, that's more geopolitically, that gives them more geopolitical clout because they expand their military and control ports, which they've done with Sri Lanka, which is what we're already seeing. Then they talk about like China waiving off debt, which is actually their first response, but we tell you no, that's only happening because of EU leverage, or Smith evidence says that doesn't happen anymore in their case. On the green tech argument, they first tell you that coal companies are struggling in China, but that's because they're struggling in China. However, they're doing great in developing countries, which our Hilton evidence tells you is that 90% are expanding to these developing countries and doing great there. Then they tell you China wants to get into green tech. Again, this is all domestically, which is what our evidence says, but in the developing countries, they want to expand their coal products. And also, this responds to their third argument about how they want to have international clout and give green tech. Again, they want to be this sort of international clout that they're going towards green tech within domestic firms, so they can be green within China domestically, but in developing nations, they're just sending their coal companies. Also, it being cheap response doesn't make sense because developing countries would be paying for this, so in the long term, they would actually want more money for them. We are winning our climate impact. Go to their case. At the top, we're going to totally agree. EU's doing all the funding, which is just feeding into our argument even more. But let's go to their first argument, their first two arguments about increasing opportunity and trade. One general response. Greer in 2018 tells you that a lot of actually what China is doing with the Belt and Road Initiative is not caring about economic interests, but rather geopolitical ones. This is why every time that we see them build ports, they just expand their military there. He concludes that right now, because of this, there's been no financial feedback on any BRI projects, which is why A, debt is so high, and B, it's not likely to change in the future. On their first warrant specifically about infrastructure, turn it against them. Tain in 2018 finds that actually this infrastructure go into a lot of these areas and destroy and displace a lot of people because they don't really care about where they're building it. Here's why this is going to outweigh their argument. Because it doesn't matter if they have like education opportunity if they leave their home and have nowhere to live. But secondly, their argument makes no sense. Infrastructure is being built to increase trading, which means it's between two urban areas, not rural areas. Their impact doesn't make any sense. On their impact about trade, first, Ruta 18 of the World Bank in 2018 turns this argument against them because BRI countries have a lot of more custom procedures and FDI policies, which means that they're more likely to have longer trade policies or trade times because there's more restrictive policies. But second, our argument from National Review tells you that specifically that it leads to debt trap diplomacy, and there's actually the ports are going to be taken away from. On our argument about their argument about clean energy, cross apply our case here. We tell you green tech is cheaper now and it's only going to be changing their will, which our DZEC evidence says they get locked in. So it doesn't matter if they have green tech because they're already locked into coal plants. But third, turn this argument against them because Goffman in 2018 finds that when you actually see BRI investment, China is going to be investing in Russia to go to the Arctic and drill in the Arctic, which Turnbull says leads to 5 degrees of warming by 2100.
Okay, before cross, let me see a few cards. Yeah. First, Ruda, and then also the Goth, the very last thing. And also displacement. Yeah, 3 cards. Yeah.
Are you taking preparation time?
Yeah. Yeah, Ruda. Okay, that's 20 seconds. What is this? Ruda. Okay, thanks. That's cool. What are the other cards? The displacement and Goth at the very end. Yeah, that. Okay.
I don't know if you want to make this faster. I'm not going to talk back, but Groffman is a piece of evidence that Brophy and St. Paul's read in their case. So if you want to just pull that up on your computer, probably won't. But yeah, I'm not going to talk like take rep time. Right? It's probably be faster if you just do that. Like forward. I mean, it's in like that will be prep too. Huh? What? Okay. It's fine. I can pull it up. What was the third one? Sorry.
And like the Russia.
Yeah.
Wait, whoa. Hard to get. Okay, you know what? It's fine. We don't need that. Don't tell me.
Yeah.
Alright, this is fine.
Oh crap.
Pretty good. Okay. Everyone good?
Yeah.
Drew, how do you build a bridge? What does it take?
I'm not sure. I'm not an architect or.
No, I mean like,
engineer.
what do you need to do to like put the bridge on the ground? Like, how does it get there?
I really
People,
don't
right?
know. Sure. Yeah. Okay.
So, okay. So like, also, how do you build a railway between two places and only do it in the most geostrategic places?
I really don't know.
I got that. That's right. You can have it.
Okay, sure. So I guess you tell me that like BRI can pull millions of people out of poverty. So what has it done so far?
Done that exact same thing.
Do you really have any evidence on that?
I mean, yeah, we can tell you like lots of different statistics about what it's done in different parts of Africa, different parts
Okay.
of Southeast Asia, different
What
parts of
statistics?
Pakistan. You just gave me a card yourself that talked about Pakistan and how it spurred economic growth in Pakistan. So what I'm trying to say is that the BRI is still largely in continuation still, but the only way to ensure that those projects are finished is to have the funding.
Okay, sure.
Okay, can I have a question?
Yeah.
Okay, so how do you solve recession?
We don't.
You don't solve recession. Okay, you can have a question.
Okay. So I guess let's talk about your argument about like education opportunity. Why is this like railways and roads being built? Like why are they being built on the BRI?
I mean, it doesn't really matter why they're being built. The fact is that they are being built. Like what,
Okay, I
like
guess
what I was
that's-
just alluding to is the fact that, like, say China finds Mozambique, Zambia, and like Gabon as geopolitically strategic, right? They have to still connect all those places together. Like, so they're still
Yeah.
going to have to do rural development to some extent.
Well,
My
not
point
necessarily
is
rural
like,
development, right? If they can connect like a city in Europe to a city in China,
okay,
what
but-
rural development happens?
but-
How does a person living in a rural area
Because in
have
order
better
to build a
access
railway, you need to go through all of Central Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe in
You
order
don't have
to
to
do
like
that.
stop. Like the train doesn't have to like stop
But
there.
the point is that it's building in order to like. Okay, well, first of all, they are doing stops because that's their whole plan, right? Their whole plan is to build it from Western China all the way through different stops on the Middle East because that's where you say is geostrategic
Okay.
or whatever. And then they keep going until Europe until they get to basically Rotterdam. And basically what they're trying to do is have economic, Rotterdam, the port in Netherlands.
Yeah, you got a question.
Yeah, okay. I can ask you one question.
Sure. I guess let's talk about green technology, right? So like you tell me that like China wants to be like have clout over green technology, right? How would they do this?
Okay, so they've already started it domestically, as you've already alluded to, right? But the thing is that they've had, like what you say, they have all these like big coal companies within China who have a lot of excess reserves. The thing is that these coal companies, they're trying to just get rid of them, as you say, right now. But the thing is that they're all transitioning towards green tech. Green tech is becoming way more cheap, which is exactly why they're investing more in green tech.
Okay.
So basically the point is that China
So, like-
is moving, especially in the long term, towards
Yes.
green tech.
Yeah. So let's
And that also means that your lock-in effect doesn't happen either, because the thing is that even if China is exporting some fossil fuels, they're exporting green tech as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So I guess my argument is, let's say
Okay.
they okay, that's kind of my bad.
Alright, so let's pause, and again, if you round were to stop right now, who is winning and why? If the answer to this one is different than the answer you wrote the first time, make sure that you're like kind of warning out like what's the reasoning behind that. Like where was that switch? Like how did that occur?
your subpoint A. Let's see. Everyone good? Start on their first warrant where they say that Europe's going to go into a recession. The key response is he turned that urgent reason rebuttal that explains that infrastructure is the best way to solve for the recession. All they say is that infrastructure is bad because it doesn't actually work. The problem is that when you have to build a road and you have to build all these bridges and railways, you need human employment, which is why we would argue that infrastructure is the best way to get out of these recessions. We've seen this in the past with historical precedent. In the Great Depression, the way we got out is with public spending and using this infrastructure spending, and the reason why is because it gave the people jobs to invest back into the economy. This outweighs their argument for two different reasons. First is on solvency. We would argue that it's better solvency because stimulus doesn't really work in times when the EU doesn't have funding in the first place, but infrastructure always works because it's a market-based response. But second, we would argue that since it's an economic downturn, it's already going to happen, but the only way you can solve for that is increase trade in the long term, which is what infrastructure causes. Onto their argument about debt traps for BRI countries. The problem is that all they say is that people have geopolitical interests and they don't care about the long term. The problem is that China has a long-term interest to have good economic relations with these other countries, which means they're not going to continue to debt trap these countries because, as both of us agree, China is having bad economic problems, which is why they want to continue to have these economic relations. Let's go on to our subpoint A, warrant 1 about infrastructure. Their only response is that there's geopolitical interest and infrastructure isn't helping anyone. We would argue it's still creating jobs and new opportunities for rural communities that don't have access to these urban centers. That's why the Meyer analysis explains that there's a $1 trillion investment into infrastructure, which is really, really important because the Puente's evidence indicates that there's new opportunities to help employment, education, and health. That's really, really important because when this infrastructure goes in, it's allowed to decrease poverty. The root analysis explains that when you put in the BRI, 7.6 million people are out of extreme poverty. This outweighs their argument for a couple of reasons. First is that you can't get out of climate change when you're when you're in poverty. When you get out of poverty, it's better for adaptation. But the second argument, which Arjun articulates really well in rebuttal, is the food shortages argument. Climate change causes a lot of food spikes. However, when you're out of poverty, you're able to adapt better to those changes. Let's go on to the green tech debate, which gets really messy at this point. They say that as soon as you negate, you're going to see all these coal plants go out. The problem is that all these coal companies are changing to green technology because it's a more profitable industry. Both of us agree that green technology is going down in price, which is why these coal companies want to go to green technology. On the long-term reasons why China is going to send out this green technology, which Drew doesn't respond to. A is the economic incentive. They're going to give green technology because it's cheaper. He agrees to this green technology and cheaper, which is a reason why they're going to give it to developing countries. The second is the geopolitical reason. Developing countries, as they say, want this green technology, which is another reason why China is going to give it to them. The third reason is they want international clout. They want to be the leader, so they're going to send out this renewable technology and look good in the international face. At that point, we would argue that we are the cleaner link into green technology because as soon as you refund the BRI, China is able to export this green technology to developing countries, which is the cleanest link to solving climate change in the round.
We're going to run a little bit of preparation time.
right, so the order of this speech is going to be discussing our case. I'm going to do a little bit of embedded weighing, and then I'm going to go into their case. Oh, that's right. All right, is everybody good to start? On our first warning about Europe, they give one response about how infrastructure is going to solve. The key concession that they make is they drop the Greer analysis. What Greer tells you is that China's intentions are strictly geopolitical and militaristic. What this means is that there is no economic gain throughout the entire history of the BRI. This means that China has not reaped any economic benefit, which means their turn about infrastructure massively stimulating the economy is literally a falsehood at the point where it's never happened in the entire history of the BRI. But secondarily, we actually reduce the time frame of the recession. What that means is that we allow for development and more investment in the long term. Our Romer evidence, which is Cole conceded, says that after the European Union funds the BRI, which both teams agree that happens, the Eurozone evidence indicates that right now Europe is having economic problems. They get pushed over the edge because they have to finance the BRI. What this does is it leads to high debt, which is going to mean 66% increasing length. This means that there is literally no investment in any economic things during the recession. We reduce the length of the recession, which means ultimately we get access to our Oxfam evidence that says after you reduce the length of the recession, every 1 minute, 100 people are going to poverty. If we reduce that by 66%, that is millions of people being pushed out of poverty. That is the cleanest link into helping the developing world, something that both teams are trying to access in this debate. They literally have no evidence on this question. Our Roman evidence is crystal clear. When debt gets higher, everything else gets cleaner. But more importantly, going on to their case. So, starting on the EU funding argument, they try and say that that rural people are going to be helped because companies are going to be going in, and they read this Meyer evidence that says that investment is going up. A, there is literally no investment during a recession. They get no offense off this. But two, still, the Greer evidence is dropped. The warranty on Greer is very clear. What it says is that in an ideal world, because projects are being canceled right now, you're going to see that the BRI literally has no economic benefit. This takes out their entire case on infrastructure because there is literally no gains. On the climate change debate, like Ryan said, it's extremely muddled, so I'm going to make it crystal clear. Let's see their first response. They say that green technology is going down in price right now and that the switch will be cheaper. However, they don't respond to the analysis that I give, that Xi Jinping is currently transitioning away from green technology and he's transitioning away from coal, which means he's offloading it to developing countries. The Zedek evidence also goes dropped, where he says that after coal-fired plants are going to be built in developing countries, because 90% of all BRI projects are coal-financed projects and actually contribute to emissions, you're going to see that there are going to be more plants being built. The issue with more plants being built is that after the coal-fired plants are already being built, they're going to be locked in, and there is literally going to be no ability, because there's going to be no political will to magically abandon these coal plants, which inherently means that they are stuck with coal, which gives us access to our Zedek evidence. What Zedek says is that right now we are at 15% emissions in the BRI countries, but after the BRI coal plants are actually emissions, we're going to see 50% global emissions. The reason we outweigh is because we co-opt all of their impacts about food insecurity, because we see that in our world, BRI emissions go way up. We are also winning the recession debate. Don't let them come up here and make any more analysis and final focus. Because recessions are cyclical, we reduce the time frame of recessions. We save millions of people from abject poverty. It's happened in the past. It'll continue to happen now.
Yeah.
So China's already investing in the green technology. How are these countries locked in?
So our argument is they're investing in green technology domestically, which means these foreign companies go to other areas.
Yeah. No, China is also investing in green technology in the BRI. So
Our Hilton evidence says that 90% of it is from fossil fuels. We read that in
evidence also says that the coal industry is a dying industry, which is exactly why they're all going to only move to green tech in the future.
No, in the future. Our argument is that long term doesn't matter. You give me three. Hold on.
Long term does matter, because here's the thing: in order to actually ensure that there is a forcible transition to green tech, you need to have aggressive action. The only way that happens is if the BRI is done with China. These countries, even if you say that they're going to switch on their own, they clearly haven't switched fast enough. The only way to do that is to ensure that infrastructure projects come in with green tech.
Okay, so the analysis and summary that is extremely important is the Zedek evidence.
What it says, we already responded to Zedek.
Not really, though. You didn't respond to the internal warrant, and I'm going to finish what I'm saying.
Sure, go ahead.
You spoke for like 30 seconds.
Yeah, sure.
All right. So the Zedek evidence says that after coal plants are offloaded in countries, there is going to be no political will to switch back to green technology, because that means that literally all of the coal plants that were built in the developing world is going to be abandoned. That's going to be a massive economic loss for China. There is no political incentive to do that, which means that emissions go up because they stick to coal.
Yeah,
Here's
I
why this is
completely
fun.
understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. First of all, you're ignoring the fact that China is also investing in green tech in addition to the coal. That is critical, because what that means is that your lock-in effect that you say is happening does not exist, which is exactly why there's not a single example of a lock-in effect yet. The reason is because they're investing in both at the same time, which means that they can't be locked into just fossil fuels.
So let me guess. Our Hilton evidence says that yes, they're investing in green tech so they can use it domestically and then transfer 90% to other countries. Here's why your response.
Can I
please finish?
Go ahead.
Okay, so here's why your part about long-term doesn't matter, because you say it's going to be cheaper to do green tech. Not if they build the infrastructure in developing countries for coal power plants. You say developing countries want it. Not if they've already built coal power plants in their country, which means the long-term happens, or long-term effect happens.
Yeah, I have a question. Okay. So let's talk about the infrastructure stuff real quick.
Sure.
Okay, so you say that like the, oh wait, let's talk about recession, sorry. Yeah. So how do you shorten the length of the recession?
It is very simple.
If you never provide any solvency.
Oh, so it's not like we don't solve the recession, we reduce the cost. And the link is very clean. No, I will make this crystal clear for everyone in the audience and for both of you. We do not solve recessions, we reduce the extent by 66%. That's been in every single speech.
Okay, but like, how do you, okay, wait a minute. Your Romer evidence is definitely, like, we ran that on the debt topic. That has nothing to do with EU investment. What I'm trying to say is like, no, it has, no, let me finish what I'm saying. Like, you have no guarantee as to say that EU investment, specifically in the BRI, is going to be enough investment to ensure that the recession is dampened by a certain
all the
amount.
Romer evidence.
Well,
Like,
this response would have been great earlier in round, but our argument is going to be that every time that we see more dollars go into debt, the recession lasts that much longer because politicians are that much
It's a scalar
afraid
impact.
to go
All
into
the money that
recessions.
EU invests, regardless of how much or how little, goes in and contributes to the recession because they go further into debt. The euro is having issues right now.
Sounds good. We'll take the rest of it. That's fine.
Actually, can we pause first?
Oh, yeah.
You guys write an RFP? Run it right now.
So we're doing
Yeah. Also, fun fact, I'm collecting these from you before you leave tonight, so make sure that there's actual words written on paper. Yeah, just your
We're doing like RFPs at the entire day.
Yeah, there will be another one after we are all done, where you like ask your final assistance. Alright, you guys good? You need another couple seconds? We have like lots of reasons as to why we're voting the way that we are at this point. Awesome. Then I will leave it up to you guys.
tech, then art, infrastructure, and then their recession. Let's start on the topic of green tech. In their final focus, or in their summary, if they would have listened to our spikes earlier, we already had responded to all of them. First of all, he talked about how Z isn't wanting to transition. Realize that there are already geopolitical reasons, which is exactly why he wants to portray this anti-American thing of doing green technology. What this means for the ground is that Z is going to ultimately switch to green tech, even if it's not happening right now. Realize that coal companies are already switching over to green tech, which is exactly why in the future they're only going to continue to do that if we fund the BRI more. But second of all, on the coal-fired plants and the lock-in, realize that we already told you the lock-in does not exist at all whatsoever because renewables and fossil fuels are already being invested at the same time, which means that they're not locked into just fossil fuels. Realize what all this means is that China is going to continue to do green technology because it's cheaper produced, and the reason why we need China to do it is because it's the only forcible way to ensure that these developing countries are actually solving for climate change that impacts to the 250,000 lives. But now on our contention one, what we tell you with Meyer is that China has a plan for $1 trillion of BRI investment. They respond essentially with this Greer evidence, but the Greer evidence is wrong for two reasons. First of all, just because it's geopolitical doesn't necessarily mean that it's not having any economic benefit. Realize that geopolitical projects like railways and stuff like that, they all spur growth by ensuring that there's increased connectivity and increased employment. But second of all, they talk about on the so what that means for the restaurant is that the Fuentes talks about how there's new opportunities because of infrastructure growth and all that, which is exactly why Ruta concludes that there are 7.6 million people lifted out of extreme poverty as a direct result of the BRI. But now that has really important implications. The first of which is solvency for the recession. They talk about the recession on their case, but the only way that you can actually solve for that recession is if you spur growth through infrastructure development. They talk about how there may be prolonging the recession. Even if you buy their entire argument on that side, the only way that you can ensure that European workers are able to reinvest and increase aggregate demand in the economy is to ensure that they have jobs to be able to do so. The only way that happens right now, as of now, is through the BRI, and that is an independent reason to vote for us there. We outweigh on solvency there because also when they talk about how there's like no stimulus when they're funding, but then the infrastructure is the only way to do that anyways. But also realize that infrastructure is the only way to solve that for climate change. It is the only way to actually adapt to the negative harms of climate change, even if you got their entire argument.
With our EU recession stuff. Yeah, like weighing with it. Okay, you ready? Start with EU recession. They have pretty much conceded that when Europe invests in the BRI, that leads to high debt, which our Romer evidence says to 66% longer recessions. That's been conceded. The only thing they give you is that infrastructure development is the best to solve with this. But that really doesn't interact with our argument. Our argument is when they have high debt, that means they're not likely to invest in infrastructure development, especially during recessions. But here's why that's really important. Because our second argument is the Greer analysis that we tell you is that they only care about geopolitical projects. This is going to be really important. Because yes, there may be some projects been proposed in the BRI that have financial success, but those projects get canceled because they don't think it has geopolitical success. That's what we've told you happens specifically. At the end of the day, we both have probably pretty solid warrants to why there may be an economic or geopolitical because they want to expand their military. You should look at the uniqueness for what's actually happening. We have seen no people be lifted out of poverty specifically, no economic gain, and no infrastructure development that actually creates jobs that happen for these people, which means the uniqueness goes to our side. Infrastructure development doesn't happen. At the end of the day, you can outweigh this because it links into all of their impacts about climate, change and infrastructure development. If we need to help prepare people there, they did the weighing themselves. We need to lift people out of poverty. Our Oxfam evidence says we do this because every minute you prevent a recession, 100 people are also pulled out of poverty. But we also outweigh on probability because every time empirically the recession lasts longer, more people go into poverty. But every time that we've invested in BRI, infrastructure development hasn't happened. The probability weighing out goes on our side. Well, let's go to specifically on their argument about infrastructure, hammer it home a little more. What we tell you is, again, the Greer analysis tells you that there has been, empirically, none of their arguments have happened, which means the uniqueness sides with us. It already should be happening in infrastructure development, yet they only care about geopolitical goals. But let's quickly go to climate change. Realize our lock-in argument is going to take out all of this argument, because even if the long term, China's transitioning into green tech, or our Hilton evidence that says 90% of the developing world gets fossil fuels, which means the lock-in effect happens. It doesn't matter what they're doing in the long term, because they don't, our Zedek evidence, which we conceded says they don't have political will. It's always cheaper to keep with the fossil fuels, and they actually don't go towards this, which means we solve for the climate change better as we create 50% more emissions. But at the end of the day, we both agree we need to prepare for climate change more.
Alright, so before we do anything more with this, can you guys write your final RFD? How are you voting?
I